You are listening to the Down the Wormhole podcast, exploring the strange and fascinating relationship between science and religion. This week, our hosts are
Kendra Holt-Moore, PhD candidate at Boston University. And if I could be a scientist, I would be a quantum scientist.
Rachel Jackson, rabbi at Agudas Israel Congregation, Hendersonville, North Carolina. And if I were a scientist, I would choose to be a geneticist.
Zach Jackson, UCC pastor in Reading, Pennsylvania, and for most of my life, I wanted to be an astrophysicist, so we're going to go with that one.
Ian Benz, Associate Professor of Elementary Science Education at UNC Charlotte, and if I could pick any science profession, I probably would have been a paleontologist.
Yeah.
I like dinosaurs. Okay, so today, in 2012, today's guest joined the University of North Carolina at Charlotte as the Carol Grotnes Belk Distinguished Professor of Bioinformatics and Genomics. He originated the field of mapping pathogen genetic data in concert with geography and host animals. He was a tenured faculty member in the College of Medicine at The Ohio State University, where he serves as a national principal investigator in the Tree of Life program of the NSF. He's advised the Obama White House, the Pentagon, and testified to both houses of Congress. I'm very pleased to welcome back to our show Dr. Dan Janies. So welcome back, Dan.
Thanks very much. Yeah.
Welcome back, Dan.
I'm really proud of that. I felt like I read that very well.
We're very proud of you too, Ian.
Thanks, guys.
Well, thanks for coming back, Dan.
My pleasure.
The last time you were on, for those who are not longtime listeners, was March 18th, 2020, way back in episode 30. Back at the beginning of this newfangled pandemic where I don't even know if we were using that word quite yet. No one really knew in the public really what was going on. I feel like that was at the time when we were just talking about like 2 weeks of lockdown to contain this, to flatten the curve so that we can get back to normal. President Trump was talking about going back to church on Easter, which I am a pastor who just went back to in-person church on Easter. He just got the wrong year. It just it took a couple extra months to get there. And a lot of what you said in that episode sounded extraordinary at the time, but now seems commonplace. I remember asking you if, what if this virus becomes airborne? And you said, oh, it is airborne. I was like, wait, what? It is? And then, sure enough, now everyone basically agrees that it is airborne. We were debating back then about where it came from. And you said, those other things, those are just red herrings. It came from bats. And there we go. Now we know. You had predicted we were still going to be talking about this in a year. And here we are a year later talking about it. So we're really happy to have you back on. To help untangle a lot of where we are today, the state of things, and what's coming up next.
Well, great. Yeah, there's certainly been a number of chapters.
No kidding. This probably isn't how you imagined your 2020 was going to go when it started.
Well, there's something about it. I've been through a few of these, and this one from the beginning felt very different. It's just a matter of getting that through our heads, and it came through our heads at different periods of time, I think.
Can we expand on that? What? This one felt different.
Look at 2009 H1N1. We all still traveled. I wasn't allowed to stay home from work. Communications people where I worked, when they thought the business community wouldn't like it, and so we had to say, cover your cough. That's about all we could say in 2009. I went to China in 2009.
Oh.
Yeah.
And I think you also said the last time we had you on the use of the word quarantine, that people were very careful in the use of that word as well.
Yeah, we couldn't say that, and they weren't going to close the schools, so we couldn't say social distance either. That was the euphemism if we were going to say something. But
yeah.
So,
and now like the cat's out of the bag. I mean, we use those phrases all the time now.
Yeah. This one turned out very different.
Do you feel a little bit like a prophet?
No, it's easy to be wrong too. I mean, some of us have even talked about being guilty about not being noisier. You know what I mean? So, I did testify to Congress. I don't know who else I'm supposed to tell.
In many ways, you do sound a lot like the Hebrew prophets.
Yeah.
So the state of things as you see them right now, where would you place us now compared to last year?
I think vaccines and the rate at which we produce them and their efficacy is just a triumph. I mean, that has been amazing. And anybody who doubts our ability to, work together and come up with solutions and multiple solutions in case one didn't work should, not have much to argue about anymore. It's just been tremendous. And now the rollout has been a challenge, but in the United States, we're doing a pretty good job. It, remains a challenge, but we're doing better than other parts of the world. And there are parts of the world like Israel, they're doing better than us. So all this is work.
I was reading something maybe yesterday or a couple of days ago that was just an article about, what was the phrase? They said something like hygiene hygiene theater. That's what it was. And that, like, what we know now about transmission being airborne and that surfaces are not really they don't play as much of a role as we thought they did a year ago, but that people continue to clean nonstop surfaces, and that it makes people feel good, but it's actually just this hygiene theater, performativity. It seems like, I don't know, it might just be where I am currently, but it seems like that's going to be something kind of hard to let go of, because it is good to wash your hands and stuff like that. But I'm just curious, and this doesn't just have to be for Dan, but it is mostly directed at Dan, I guess. How are we going to stop wasting money on cleaning protocols that we don't have to do? Is it a good idea to stop all of that? Is there something valuable in signaling cleanliness? To me, it seems a little bit shallow, I guess. But I understand that there could be value in it. What do you predict for the coming months and the next year? Yeah,
well, you're doing a lot. You're just not stopping SARS-CoV-2 transmission with cleaning surfaces. SARS-CoV-2, the vast majority of it, as we covered, is airborne transmission, respiratory droplets. But there are pathogens that are transferred on surfaces, bacterial pathogens and so forth. So, food hygiene is largely dependent on surface contamination and so forth. So, or water contamination. So that you're going to have better food hygiene, which is always a good thing.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. But all the extra stuff, wiping down the desks or whatever, I guess there's value in that. Kids maybe won't get as sick with other things, but I guess part of what was interesting to me about that was that there's been so much money, especially when you're looking at different public schools or just other organizations that could be putting all that money into air filters and stuff like that. Yeah. But they're spending so much money on cleaning supplies, and there is obviously, what you're saying, that does help for a lot of other things. But it's just where do we find the balance of actually, if the priority right now is COVID, it makes sense to do more of the airborne precautions. But what about 5 years from now? Because
I think that's a great question, and it's probably it's going to masks will probably become a matter of personal preference going forward. And schools are regulated, so that won't be personal preference, but it'll probably be, find some reasonable balance going forward. But once we're humans, once we started doing something, it's hard to reverse course, right? So it's just a human nature thing, I think.
Is there such a thing, do you think, as too much usage of these things?
I've not heard of that, but if it's anything, if it's preoccupying you so you don't do other things, or you're burning yourself, there are people who wash their hands too much and wreck their skin, I think those things are.
Right. This idea of antibacterial, right? That we're using all these antibacterial wipes for everything.
Oh.
Are we just making stronger bugs?
Yeah, I don't have any particular expertise on that. I think these, antibacterial products certainly do provide some of the selective force I think that's demonstrated. I have to look up the paper that is driving antimicrobial resistance, but I'm just using intuition here. That's probably nothing compared to overuse of antibiotics, which we use in our own bodies and we use wantonly in agriculture, and that's just the concentrations being used in those settings is tremendous. So I think we'll come back to not so much caring about over cleaning, but hopefully caring about other problems. And to shift gears a little bit here, think of antibiotic resistance was the the crisis that we've forgotten about. Cancer screenings haven't been done. People haven't gotten their teeth cleaned, and so there's all this neglected maintenance and refocusing we're going to have to do.
So what do you think of, like, being that we kind of talked a little bit about like classroom spaces and things like that? I remember back last spring, so a year ago, in conversations about what could the fall look like at our university, Dan, at UNC Charlotte, and like even in lab spaces or classroom spaces, many classrooms may have, access to like a staplers or whatever that students could pass around, or anything like that could be communal supplies. There was all this talk of, well, we couldn't have that, the concerns around we can't have communal supplies in your classrooms and stuff like that. Do you think, is that still a concern? I mean, because, our university is going to be back primarily face-to-face in the fall. Most universities probably will be. Most schools are going that route as well. I mean, is that something that you think that teachers and others will have to clean the desk spaces and stuff like that in between classes and things like that?
Yeah, I'll have some thoughts about them, but bear in mind, I'm not authorized to speak about university operations by any means. So,
right.
These are just generic thoughts. I think we can be reasonable about it. I think people are going to like more personal space and having their own things. And I'd like to work in a clean environment. I bet the cases of SARS-CoV transfers based on shared staplers are almost none, though. Let's put it that way.
Right.
So I wanted to go back to this vaccine question a little bit, if you may. You seem very, very optimistic, which I think is wonderful, recognizing that as a whole, our country is doing well. Right. And in some places adequate, some places, some populations very poor, but taken as a whole, we're doing well. Right. My social commentary is that there's certainly issues with racial justice surrounding that. But if we take the country as a whole, we're certainly doing better than others, and certainly doing better than what we were doing. So when we look at vaccines, one of the things that we're facing now, and I was listening to an NPR story about this, was saying that very soon we're going to have a surplus. But we're still not at a place where we're reaching this generalized herd immunity, whether or not that herd immunity is 75% or 85% or even 90%. We know that it's above 70. Like, comfortably, we know that above 70 is where we need to go. And we're at 25% looking at this question of having a surplus. And for me, part of when I look at that, part of the reason for that is our disparities in terms of equity. But then there's also a question of there's a lot of people that just aren't going to take it. And what do you think as a scientist that we can do to encourage us getting to that place?
Well, I think several things, and I think it's going to be patchy. And that's the problem with the herd immunity question is surpluses are occurring in some states already because they've just exhausted the number of people willing to take the vaccine. And I think, and let's just be honest, with any medical intervention, there's a small risk of an adverse reaction. And some people have a psychology against needles. Some people have a psychology against distrust in medicine. And those are all things we're going to have to work on. I think, though, the recent news about Johnson & Johnson and most previous to that, AstraZeneca vaccines causing blood clots is definitely concerning and will be followed up on by the full force of regulatory agencies. But bear in mind, your chances of having an adverse outcome to SARS-CoV-2 infection are about 125 times more than having an adverse reaction to a vaccine. It's terrible for the people who have had those reactions, but it's something like six individuals in 7 million. So it's terrible for all those people, and we got to do better. But and people who have these emotional reactions to vaccine and medicine don't really respond to those numbers, right? So I just think it's a hard question, and I think it's a question of science literacy just for many things. And this speaks to the misinformation too, which finds opportunity in these, in these areas where the vaccines have slightly failed or where there's mistrust sown already. And I just think, we should just keep doing what we're doing in terms of nature of science instruction. Science isn't perfect. Vaccines aren't perfect, but they're better than nothing and way better than these ones are wildly good. The SARS coronavirus 2 vaccines are 90% effective, whereas we lived happily with influenza vaccines that were, 30, 40, 50% effective, So if you're going out in the rain, take a raincoat, to me, it's common sense,
So that why is are they recommending the vaccine, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, be put on hold when it seems like it seems safer than any of the medications you see advertised on TV with their litany of side effects afterwards? Is this just for PR and public confidence, or is it actually concerning?
Well, it's, those ads don't have those disclaimers because they like them. It's regulated, right? They have to put them. So the major concern is, of course, for all those individuals that are infected, but they're affected by an adverse reaction. But the erosion of public trust by a small event is worse in terms of continuing to give the virus new hosts by all the people who can't, or because they're not eligible, or because of underlying conditions, or because they just have a emotional or psychological problem with taking a vaccine. And this speaks back to the herd immunity question, and nobody can really calculate what that is. But the best estimate I heard, or the best sort of way to explain it, is 60% sounds good, because if the transmission rate of the virus is 3, and that number is varied. That means for every person infected, you're infecting 3 others. If we immunize 2 of those potential new infections, we're taking them off the playing field, off the table for SARS coronavirus 2, leaving only 1. So R naught goes to 1. So every person infected only infects 1 more person. The virus spread is not growing. It's at sort of a steady state then. And that doesn't sound great. I mean, I think coronavirus is going to be with us like influenza is with us. We'll tame it down to that low-level transmission. But there will always be new hosts. There's always going to be children. And hopefully we get the vaccines approved for children. But there's always newborns, and there's always people who won't take it. And there's always the virus continuing to evolve, which we've seen in influenza for decades.
So you think we are solidly on the path to this being a seasonal thing and not being eradicated like MERS?
Yeah. I think early hope and some of the uncertainty around SARS-CoV-2, this notion that it was different, but we couldn't explain why, was tied to MERS going. MERS didn't really go extinct, though. SARS-1, I'll call it, but I mean SARS-CoV, did go extinct. MERS, there were cases until 2018. People think it went away in 2015, but there were still cases until 2018. So MERS might be clinking around out there. But SARS-CoV-2 was clearly different. It didn't show any seasonality, really. Our behaviors drove more the transmission of the virus, and our lack of vaccines, our lack of any defense against it. And so we think of flu as seasonal. It may show some seasonality, SARS-CoV-2, but think of influenza H1N1. That actually merged in April, where we're supposed to be coming out of flu season. So,
you said SARS-CoV-1 did go extinct, right?
That lineage went extinct. This is the most important thing.
What made that one happen?
It emerged from bats. And
no, but I mean, why did that go extinct? Did we have vaccines against it?
No, that's a great question.
That's what I thought.
Ran out of hosts in the countries. We didn't experience it so much in the U.S., so we don't think about it, but just good infection control. It was transmitting a lot between patient and healthcare workers. And in Toronto, for example, and they were able to stomp it out. And in Beijing, there was panic in the streets. I mean, there was nobody in the streets. They just shut down Beijing. And so early responses, I think, muted it quickly. But the point is, from an evolutionary perspective, all the cousins of SARS-CoV-1, one of which was MERS, one of which was SARS-CoV-2, there's probably, I don't know the number, but there are multiples of these things clinking around in bats all the time. And what happened with SARS-CoV-2 is one emerged that turned out to be incredibly transmissible and very well adapted to human transmission, and continues to adapt through variants.
Right.
And that was a game changer. And we're worried about SARS-CoV-3, SARS-CoV-4, and anything else. I mean, we've not even paid attention to the rest of the virus sphere for a long time. So that's what we got to start doing.
Do you think that? So you were indicating that this family lineage, SARS and MERS and SARS-CoV-2, originated from bats, and the second one has also the one that we're more focusing on, SARS-CoV-2, came from bats and the bat to human transmission. Do you think that there's my question is twofold. Do you think that there are other completely different family lines that has nothing to do with the SARS-CoV that are coming from bats? And second part of that is, are there other animals that we also need to be thinking about that could have this potential transmission that that we haven't really focused on?
Yeah, great question. So certainly bats are the most important host for these severe medically important coronaviruses, SARS, MERS, CoV-2. However, rodents have been the source of other coronaviruses. Animal to human transmission events have been recorded in the literature since the 60s, and have been recorded in genomes since, I would say right after SARS. We started to sequence when I was at Ohio State, a lot of the agriculturally important coronaviruses. And in fact, a lot of them do come from cows and their cousins, camels, in the case of MERS. Those coronaviruses infect people, but they cause something akin to a common cold. And so there was never a lot of medical concern about them. So
right, medically, who cares?
Yeah. And colds, we call it a cold, or we call it influenza-like illness. One of the soapboxes I like to get on is we don't really know what causes those things. They're one of 30 potential things. Could be a rhinovirus, could be bacteria sometimes, and we never really diagnose the pathogen itself like we have begun to do with SARS-CoV-2 to delineate it from influenza and so forth. I think that sort of personalized attack on the bug itself rather than the symptoms is going to be widely important now. And then we'll know more. We'll be able to backtrack to the animal sources of these things. So that's a great question, and it opens up an area of science I've been hoping to open up for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Just sort of putting on this other question, how is this, for those that aren't super well-read, myself included, in terms of what is the difference of, I'll just use the bat as example, right? Sure. Bat to human transmission, as opposed to some of these other diseases that we see as carriers. For example, malaria in mosquitoes, or you said rodents, and that immediately got me thinking, the Black Death or the Black Plague from centuries ago, which was brought in by rodents, but it wasn't from rodents. It was, the bugs on them, and then it got to us. Like, what is, how, talk to me like I'm 5 in terms of what does it mean to actually have this transmission, to cross that barrier, and how is that different than these other sort of insect-driven issues?
It all matters. It comes down to the nature of the biology. So pathogens they're all just hitching a ride, right? And so the bats are good at flying these things around, and the bat immune system, and this is a whole other area too, seems to be able to fight them off or run so hot, so to speak, that they don't get infected. And I think they've even reduced their immune repertoire, so they're just flying around happy full of viruses. I mean, it's true. There's Nipah, Hendra. Don't handle bats, whatever you do. So,
It's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Gross and cool.
Yeah. Well, it's biology. Yeah. Don't go to lunch with biologists either. Yeah. So that, the bat question is probably people going into caves and collecting guano. I guess it's valuable. Maybe eating them. I've heard of bat consumption around the world. And then let's switch to insect-borne diseases. Mosquitoes are worse than bats, right? They cause more death and destruction than almost anything on Earth in terms of malaria and flaviviruses, Zika and dengue and so forth. And the female mosquito essentially bites your friend and takes some of their blood. And if your friend has the malaria parasite called Plasmodium in it, it's the genus Plasmodium. It's a little thing called an apicomplexan parasite. Then that female mosquito goes onto you and bites you and then injects that Plasmodium into you. And then you get malaria, right? And in terms of bacterial pathogens like plague, living close to rats, and I suppose, historically rats were getting into food stores, grain and so forth, and people were eating that and getting infected. And then once it gets into people, you're handling the body and so forth. And that goes back to all these hygiene issues. Bacteria are terrible too.
So we should really... I know this is not what you're saying, but, part of one of the things that I could hear you saying is be vegan and wear a mosquito suit all the time. Like if we want to protect ourselves from these things, like that's...
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about malaria is we had it in the United States. We had yellow fever in the United States. And so we don't have to be personally hypersensitive or hypersensitive to what's around us if we do reasonable public health, like control standing water, have screens on our windows, simple things like that lead to mosquito control.
And they're the most horrible things. I am from a religious standpoint, and from a perhaps a standpoint of I believe that things have a place and there's domino effects when there's extinctions. We don't fully understand the ramifications of things, but I think the world would be better without mosquitoes. I see only positives from that. I see nothing good from the mosquito. And
how will we recreate Jurassic Park without mosquitoes?
I don't care.
Then I can become a paleontologist.
So much. And that's right.
No, you'd just be a biologist at that point.
I'm one of those people that doesn't get like a cute little mosquito bite. Oh, it itches a little bit. It's like it becomes a welt. And it just like my whole is awful. So is there any purpose to mosquitoes that you could shed light on?
No, people have brought up what you have is, why don't we just extinct them?
Yeah.
And there are ways to do it. I don't think they'll ever be successful. Mosquitoes are...
We're very good at extincting.
Yeah, we're good at extincting some things. Yeah. But people would argue that you're taking away the food source for other organisms, like our friends the bats,
okay.
But also our friends the fish.
Well, can't we just make more flies then?
Yeah. One would say, look at Australia. Every animal transportation or eradication attempt has gone awry. So.
So I want to ask a question about the variants I keep hearing about.
Sure.
And a question born out of ignorance, because I keep hearing these acronyms thrown around and these different variants of places from the UK, from South Africa, from Brazil. There was that one in the Netherlands that was coming through mink. And we were all worried about that one. And I hear people saying, oh, don't worry, the vaccine still seems to be fairly effective against it. But here in Pennsylvania, we have one of the highest rates of transmission right now. We are, I think, in the top 3 worst states right now for new cases, which is super exciting. Can you shed some light on on some of these variants, on the development of them? What do you have your eye on in particular?
Yeah, sure. So when we had those, spikes late 2020, early 2021, there were a lot of cases. And every time the virus is replicating itself, it'll make mistakes, right? And a lot of those mistakes and mutations will produce viral lineages that are not as successful in transmitting themselves as their cousins. But some will. And so UK variant not only was different by about 15 mutations, but also started to become predominant in the UK. And those are the two kind of harbingers or indicators of a successful variant, right? And what's interesting about the UK variant, though, is the vaccines are still pretty effective against it. It's the South Africa variant, which shares some of the same mutations as the UK variant, and especially the Brazilian variant, that shows some ability to not be neutralized by the antibodies produced in your body by the first versions of the vaccines, okay? However, remember, these vaccines were 90% effective against what we call the wild type, the original SARS-CoV-2. So they had some ground to give, and they're still certainly effective. The number of breakthrough cases where people who were beyond 2 weeks since their second Pfizer or Moderna shot, for example, I think in the United States, something like 5,000 total people have been infected. But that's a very small number against, 40,000 successful injections, right? So they do occur. Nobody ever said these vaccines were perfect. They're slightly less perfect against variants, but we do have to be vigilant. I mean, there are stories out of Brazil that they thought, not by vaccination because they've had a terrible rollout, but in the city of Manaus in the Amazon, they thought that they had herd immunity just because 60% of the people have had coronavirus just because of transmission. And the variant emerged, and, it's not going away. This is just SARS coronavirus 2 and evolution doing its job. And all those people got reinfected by the Brazilian variant. So there was, so it's just been ravaging in Brazil. And we don't want that here. And I'm not surprised the UK variant got around. The border was open. You could fly to London and back, especially post-Brexit, right? The interesting thing here is, too, where there are a few cases of Brazilian variant, but they've been all travel cases and stopped. In South Africa variant, they say it occurs here in South Carolina, in other states. I looked at the original data, and it's not very good. So I'm worried. I'm vigilant. And
what does that mean? I'm sorry. What does not very good mean?
They sequenced the virus, and it was an incomplete sequence. And some of the key mutations were not characterized. They had, say these things are characterized on 15 mutations. They had 8 of them, and they called it as good enough. So so it's not that, oh no, the data is showing bad. It's saying the data was bad. The data was
like it
incomplete.
wasn't good science.
Yeah. So I'll take that back tomorrow if more data comes out and it's all good. But these things there's also domestic variants occurring too. There's a variant they call the California variant. There was an Ohio or Midwest variant, and we're watching all of those. Vaccines seem to continue to work against those, even though they're transmitting a lot. So our domestic variants are not quite as worrisome as these originally foreign variants. And all these things have overlap. So to call them a unique entity is a little bit strange. They're nested sets of mutations, so to speak.
I just wanted to follow up and ask, do we know why the vaccines work against some of the variants and not others? Is that still just like totally mysterious to us? Or is there something that people are finding, like, this is why it's sort of effective?
The key part of the spike protein that binds to your cells, called the receptor binding domain, those are sort of the business end of the virus, and the antibodies produced by the original vaccine against those are not as effective as against the new variants who have modified that receptor binding domain. So those new variants are modifying their business end to get into your cells, even though you've been vaccinated.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's just that some mutations are like closer.
They're in the right
original
spot
form than others.
Well, yeah, and they're in the right spot. They've hit on.
Yeah.
There's one called E44K, which seems to open up a lot of infectious territory for the virus. Then there's one called N501Y that does the same. And some of these things have to happen in sets. Like one has to change to compensate for the loss of fitness of the virus. Might work a little bad if it only had that one, but if it has two, it works even better. So it's a complicated choreography that the virus does through evolution.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then I guess one more follow-up, because I know Rachel also has a question, is, if some of these variants are so different that the vaccines we have now aren't really doing it, do you think that in the future we will be able to formulate a vaccine that can cover all variants, or are we going to end up with like multiple vaccines to cover different kinds of variants, and it'll just be like extra shots every year?
Yeah, there's a couple questions there. So the first thing is the vaccines are good. They remain good and effective against most variants. The most important thing is, even if you're reinfected, you have some immune protection. And the people who are reinfected, the small fraction that are reinfected, are not going into the intensive care and are not dying. And so you may have a mild experience rather than just being immunologically naive, being infected post-inoculation, but you're not going to die, right? And you're not going to go to the hospital. So that's the most important thing. Mm-hmm. And that's the key message. So it's not game over with a variant.
Yeah.
But it's an ongoing game, right? And an ongoing struggle. And there's a couple of things going on. Is we want to roll out, there's a window of opportunity to roll out more and more vaccinations before the virus continues to vary in a way that we can't combat. And then also back to the lab, right? Studies are being done to reprint the vaccine. These vaccines are, especially the mRNA vaccines, they're amazing. You basically just specify what kind of protein what kind of mRNA you want to make, which is the instructions for your body to make the protein for your antibodies to respond to. So they can just say, okay, we see you variant, we're printing you out, and we're going to put that in people now. So that's just tremendous. I mean, we are incrementally winning this arms race if we do all things right, if we prepare and we do all our due diligence and people listen.
Right.
That's a big.
You can hear all of our cynicisms in that laugh.
Yeah.
It is really cool though, and like really,
we are much better prepared than we were 6 months ago. It's just amazing. And now, I mean, I'll go on for just a minute more. There's talk of preparing mRNA technologies against cancer, preparing mRNA technologies against all kinds of other infectious agents. So although as terrible as this was, the technological spin-off could be tremendous. And, vaccines and infectious disease were not a well-funded enterprise for a long time, and now we've learned our lesson the hard way. It was in the 70s, I think, at least the American medical enterprise said, cancer is where it's at, and we think infectious disease is pretty much whipped, and that's completely not true.
So is it because of the mRNA technology? Is that what makes these vaccines so effective? I mean, you talked about, like, even historically, the percentage, 90 to 95% effective is just mind-boggling compared to historically with vaccines. Is it because of that technology?
Well, bear in mind the adenovirus, which is also a relatively newly employed technology too, were also very effective. So much it was, Johnson & Johnson was one shot at 76%. I think we had the advantage of, at the time, fighting one variant, whereas with influenza, there's multiple circulating variants all the time. It's been around, for a long time. Whereas this SARS-CoV-2 was newly emergent. It looked like one thing at the time the decisions were being made. Whereas influenza, it's basically a committee decision. And if nowadays we design a vaccine against 4 of them, and it's a lot of guesswork. But this was not guesswork. The mRNAs were printed against the SARS-CoV-2 that came out of Wuhan, and so now they're going to have to print them against the one coming out of South Africa, the one coming out of Britain.
I should point out for those at home who are not super familiar with the way that vaccines have worked, and you can feel free to correct me because I'm sure I'll be wrong, but the way that flu vaccines have worked is, basically they try to figure out ahead of time which ones are going to be the dominant strains, and they have to isolate those strains and then breed those strains in isolation and breed a variant that is less deadly and then kill it and then put it into egg whites.
Yes.
Right? And that whole process takes months and months and months and tons of eggs for some reason. I think people still don't realize how in some ways primitive the technology is, whereas the mRNA vaccine contains the information for your body to do the creating of the thing that it wants to have resistance against. And so we have the information about the spike protein at the end. We tell your arm muscle, make that spike protein. Your immune system goes, what is this mess? We need to kill this.
And sleep.
And then a couple weeks later, it's like, it's back again? All right, now we really need to remember this. And then whenever it sees the spike protein chilling on a coronavirus, it goes and eats it up. And there's no eggs that have to be used.
Excellent. With the one caveat that cell culture is now used for a lot of influenza vaccine production. So, but I would bet money that we see mRNA vaccines from influenza in the near future too, and other viruses.
So, from a genetic standpoint, I'm really trying to understand why this technology took until now to be used. Right? I think there's sort of a maybe a general misconception in the overall populace that this mRNA, it's brand new and we've never seen it before, and it's this newfangled thing, when there's this woman, Caitlin Carrico, and I might be mispronouncing her name. I've only read it. She's been doing this for 30 years. So why, not just a why now, but why not then? Like what has changed in the genetics field? What has changed in epidemiology that has said, sure, let's try it now?
I think the crisis, and the business model wasn't there before, and the crisis drove for there to be a business model for a rapidly developed vaccine that was tunable. And we put enough money into it that we didn't bank on just one technology. So nobody said it's mRNA or nothing. They also did adenovirus technology, and
What if we'd done this 20, 30 years ago? Like, what if, because you're saying, one of the statements you just made was that there's a potential now that we've seen the efficacy and that we've poured money into it, that We might transition from the influenza vaccine that we all know and love and hate and take, putting that one out there, to this completely new way of understanding it. Why wouldn't we have done that 20 years ago?
Just conservatism. I mean, getting things approved is hard. Vaccines aren't. I'm not an expert in this field, but I understand that it's not a great business. It does take a lot of government influence and incentives. There's this agency called BARDA, BARDA, that their role is to protect the country by making government investments in pharmaceutical development such that we are prepared for this. And I imagine agencies like that will become ever more important in how we run the country.
So can I ask you something just for clarification with the fact that we, at the very beginning of this, when we realized we need to develop and produce and distribute vaccines to beat this thing, were the ideas already there well before this of mRNA technology is the way we should go in the future? Or was this we need all hands on deck, whatever technology you have, you better use it?
Yeah, the latter in this case. But this was, hopefully a 100-year flood. All these technologies existed on paper, or even in the case of adenovirus vector technology, it was used in the gene therapy field, and there was a death of a patient, and so it got taken off the shelf because that was recently resurrected in terms of vaccines.
Okay. But mRNA technology, I'm sorry, you may have said it earlier. What else was it used for prior to this? Because obviously it's existed, but for medical treatments, has it been used for other things?
I'm not aware of any. I could be wrong about that, but we use it every day to make, to transcribe our DNA into proteins. So right. You're doing it right now. Yeah. So
what we've sort of had sort of a roundtable Q&A today, which I really appreciate that you've been able to be here for, Daniel, and allowed us to have this. We're limited by what we know. So are there things that you want to tell us and all those listening, things that we just didn't even know to ask? Yeah.
Please, seek a vaccine if you're able, and your physician and, the regulation allows you to. You're taking advantage of tremendous technology that's not going to only, make your health better, but everybody around you. That's what's amazing about, vaccines. So yeah, I would like to see this starting to be part of good citizenship, and something that we touched upon in prep that we haven't really gotten to is the threat of misinformation. And so I think also it's a matter of good citizenship not to forward wonky things. It's a free country. You can say whatever you want, but, I would like people to care about their reputations online and then maybe try to check multiple sources or ask questions. And not only we having this done to us by foreign adversaries who, for whatever reason, want to slow down our rollout or want to diminish the quality of our vaccine or the perceived quality of our vaccine so they can sell theirs. We're starting to do it to ourselves, which is a shame. So we're starting to misinform ourselves for whatever reason.
What have been some of your biggest surprises? I know you talked about this a little bit earlier, but over the past year, like things that have just really surprised you about your field, scientific community in general, the public? I mean, just...
Yes, I would say three things. How big SARS-CoV-2 was versus its predecessors, MERS and SARS-CoV. 2, our lack of ability to see what was happening, and we saw it in China and we didn't believe it. China and Italy, and not take it seriously. That American arrogance, or however you want to put it, which I hated to say, I wouldn't have said it in 2019, but the fact that this wasn't going to happen to us was just surprising. And then how bad it was, and how we thought how we couldn't hold the fort, right? We thought we were through this, and people are impatient and they relax their behaviors. And now that we even have the vaccines, people don't want to accept them. And we have this window of opportunity now, a real window of opportunity that's not even, terrible. If you have a vaccine, you can see your grandkids, you can circulate, you can do all the fun things you want. And people are not accepting it. And so all this it's going to be an ongoing struggle, I think, on multiple fronts.
What's your most optimistic projection for what 2021 will look like for the world?
I think it's going to matter everywhere. It's going to be patchy. I think our economy is already recovering, I think, through tremendous stimulus. I don't know how long that's going to last. I'm digressing into a different field here, but but we have the tools to get out of this thing. We just need to bear down and use them. There are places in the world where it's going to be bad for a long time. And Brazil has a terrible rollout. These places that bought vaccines from China and Russia may get them, may not get them. They may work fine, but they can't produce in the numbers that need to be produced. We definitely could roll out some of our surplus once we get to that point to other countries, and we shall. But that's gonna take time. So I think we're going to be okay. I think there's going to be pockets of the world that are not going to be okay for a very long time.
Then how does that play in for us?
Don't count on traveling anytime soon.
Yeah,
and go to the Grand Canyon or something. I don't know. Like you're not going to Asia or you're not going to the Olympics. You're not going to Europe anytime soon. You can.
Yeah, I feel like the impact on international travel.
Yeah.
Is going to last for a long time.
Yeah.
I just feel like there's potential for that for several years.
Yeah. So.
But I can go to a Phillies game this summer.
Sure.
If you wanted.
I mean, it is the Phillies. Right.
Yeah. I think we'll get back to normal domestic activities, including school in the fall.
Including drunken karaoke in a smoky bar.
Just don't. I said this in another podcast. I think individually packaged peanuts are going to be advisable.
Wow.
Oh, you should already see the variety in individually packaged communion kits.
Yeah,
they have, just in the past year, exploded in variety and flavors and shapes and sizes, and we're all about that individual packaging now.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
Thanks
for taking time to spend with us, to answer our questions, to help illuminate some of our pockets of ignorance. I hope that things will really roll out as well as you make them seem, at least here. You were not very optimistic for the rest of the world, but I hope you're wrong about that. Though I doubt you are. You've been right about everything so far.
If only. Well, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Dan.
It's really important work that you're doing, so thanks very much.
Thank you.
All right.